Section 1.8 deals with absolute value equations and inequalities. But before we jump into solving those things, let's talk a minute about what absolute value is and how it works. Absolute value we know is the distance a number is from 0 on the number line. But algebraically speaking, it is said that if x is greater than or equal to 0, then the absolute value of x just equals x. It equals itself. If the number inside there is already positive, then the absolute value of it just stays itself. But if the number inside the absolute value is less than 0, if that number is negative, then the absolute value of it is equal to the opposite of that number. So all it's telling you is that if what's in there is positive, we keep it the same. But if what's in there is negative, we take the opposite to make it positive. Make sense? That's the definition of absolute value. Let's take a look at these 4 examples. The absolute value of 7 is just 7. The absolute value of negative 3 is 3. How about the negative absolute value of negative 7? Yeah, the negative outside stays, but the absolute value of negative 7 becomes positive 7. And then here's a tough one. We have the absolute value of x minus 2. Whether that stays x minus 2 or becomes the opposite, negative x plus 2, depends on the value of x. So what you do is you take the inside and you set it equal to 0. What makes the inside of the absolute value go to 0? Where does it go to 0? Positive 2. So the inside of that absolute value goes to 0 at positive 2. So let's say if x is greater than or equal to positive 2, will what's in there be positive or negative? Okay. Let's say if I put, 5 in there. Let's say positive, and it would stay itself, right? Okay, so if x is greater than or equal to 2, the inside of the absolute value will be positive. And we say that the absolute value of x minus 2 will just equal what's inside there. But if x is less than 2, then the absolute value of that x minus 2 is going to be negative. Like if I put a 0 in there, I get the absolute value of negative 2, right? Well, the absolute value of a negative is equal to the opposite. So then we have to say it equals negative x plus 2. So that's a little hard for students to understand, but that's how you define absolute value of variables. That's how you split them up and write them. It's actually considered a piecewise notation when you look at it. You'll talk a lot more about piecewise functions as time goes on, so don't get too bogged down in them right now. But just understand that you find the number where it goes to 0, because that's where it's going to split from positive to negative, equal or opposite. Then you set it up, and you figure out which one would make it positive, and that will stay the same, and which one would make it negative, and that will become the opposite of what's in there. Now that we have a basic understanding of what absolute value is and how it works with variables, we're going to solve absolute value equations. We're going to look at the absolute value of 3x minus 5 equals 7 and try to figure out what values of x will make that true, if any. Well, first off, we know that 3x minus 5 has to equal one of 2 things. What are they? 7 or negative 7. If 3x minus 5 already equals 7, the absolute value of 7 will be 7. But if 3x minus 5 equals negative 7, the absolute value will still be 7. So there are 2 possibilities there. So what we're going to do is we're going to split that up. Into the 2 possibilities. What's inside equals 7, what's inside equals negative 7. We're going to solve them both. If we solve the left one, we see that x would have to equal positive 4. So there's one possibility. If we solve the right one, add 5 to both sides, and we see that 3x equals negative 2, x equals negative 2/3. So there's another possibility. And you should always check them. Okay, absolute value are known for putting out extraneous solutions. You should check them. You can check them by plugging back into the original. 3 times 4 is 12. 12 minus 5 is 7. The absolute value of 7 is 7. So positive 4 definitely checks out and is one of our answers. Negative 2/3. If I plug in negative 2/3, I have absolute value of 3 times negative 2/3 minus 5. And we want to know if that equals 7. Well, 3 times negative 2/3 is negative 2 minus 5. So I have the absolute value of negative 7, and that does equal 7. So both of those answers work. None are extraneous. For those of you who are trying to store and check in your calculators, do you guys remember where to find the absolute value symbol? Either it's hidden, it's under the map menu, but you can also find it under second 0. Yeah, second catalog, second 0. It's one of the first things listed there. So if you want to store and check instead of doing it by hand. So there are the two answers.
So you're finding the value of x's. I can't think that.
When you're asking to solve an equation, you're finding the value of x's that would make that equation true. For the one that you were upset about before, that was just kind of a generic, what does it mean when I say the absolute value of a variable? Don't get too hung up on
You're just
that.
making this true.
Yeah, we just want to know what values I could substitute in here to make them true. Okay, let's take a look at this. People do really well with absolute value equations as long as they remember to isolate the absolute value before they start. Do y'all remember that? To solve an absolute value equation, you should isolate the absolute value and then split it into the two possibilities, one positive, one negative. That goes all the way back to Algebra 1. We did those, first 9 weeks of Algebra 1. Here's where people start to have trouble. If an equation has two absolute values, not just one but two, people really get into trouble. I don't know why, it just upsets them. But basically, if A and B represent algebraic expressions, the equation absolute value of A equals absolute value of B is always equivalent to A either equals B or A equals the opposite of B. That's all you can have. Okay? So when you set up an equation, when you split it apart, that has two absolute values, it's either the left side, what's inside the left equals exactly what's inside the right, or they're opposites. Those are the only two things that could be true. For example, if I say that the absolute value of 3 equals the absolute value of 3, that's true, right? 3 equals 3. What's in there is already equal, so definitely their absolute values are equal. But it's also true that the absolute value of 3 equals the absolute value of negative 3, right? So there's two possibilities to consider. They're either equal or they're opposites going in. We just want to keep that in mind when we start to solve these. Let's take a look at the absolute value of 2x is equal to absolute value of x minus 3. The absolute value of 2x is equal to the absolute value of x minus 3. So you kind of have to think to yourself, what has to be true for those two absolute values to equal?
2x.
Either 2x equals
X minus 3.
or 2x is equal to the opposite of x minus 3. What's the opposite of x minus 3?
Negative x plus 3.
Negative x plus 3, yeah. So you could say set them equal to each other and then set the left one equal to the negative.
Why would you do negative 2x?
You could, but you only change one of them to the opposite. Yeah, it doesn't matter which one. I usually keep the left, change the right. If you change both of them to their opposite, it undoes itself. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So it'd be the same type of
It would basically, you get the same answer again. Yes, you have to set them exactly equal, and then you have to set one of them equal to the opposite, not both of the opposites equal. Because those two negatives would cancel each other out. Okay, solve them both. Subtract x, and we have 1x is equal to negative 3. And over here, if we add x to both sides, we get 3x equals 3. So x equals positive 1. And you need to be sure that you check them. Always, always check for extraneous solutions. So let's go back to the original and let's substitute in negative 3. Absolute value of 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. And we want to know if that equals the absolute value of negative 3 minus 3. Is it true that absolute value of negative 6 equals negative 6? Yes? Okay, so negative 3 works. Now let's test positive 1. Absolute value of 2 times 1 is 2. an absolute value of 1 minus 3 is negative 2. And sure enough, they're still equal even when the inside are opposites. So both of those make them true. They are both our solutions. Negative 3 and positive 1.